ThePrint, and I'm here to talk to you about the importance, about the significance of the visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to India. Now, we know that this is an annual summit. What that means is that one year the Indian Prime Minister goes to Moscow, and the other year the Russian President comes to Delhi. So this is the turn of the Russian President to come to India. So it's Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He's a very strong and powerful leader. He's been in power in Russia for the last 20 years in one way or another. He was Prime Minister for several years, and he's been President for several years. And again, in May this time, he was elected for the fourth time, which means that he's going to be President of Russia for another 6 long years. Now, among the most important agreements that were signed today during his visit, 8 agreements were signed, and apart from that, there was this very significant signature on India's purchase of the S-400 missile. Now, there has been a lot of talk about the S-400. The Americans have been warning India that we will sanction you, that we will impose sanctions on you in case you do buy these missiles from Russia. But the Indian government has held firm, Prime Minister Modi has held firm, and he has said that no, we will go ahead, India will go ahead and buy these missiles. Having said that, the story is a little bit more complicated. What has happened is that India has committed to buying these missiles from the Russian government, and meanwhile, India has already also committed to buying other defense equipment from the US. So the question is, the fact is that the Prime Minister, that's Prime Minister Modi, and the Indian government is hoping that in this evolving, fluctuating world of uneasy relationships and partnerships, America is declining, China is becoming a strong power, and India wants to hedge its bets and wants to make friends and partnerships with the world. So please, looking forward to your questions on this YouTube Live. I believe there is a question. If you'll excuse me just a second. Okay, so Ratna, I believe you've asked a question. What is the future? What's the future? That's a huge question. Will India tilt towards Trump's America, or will India tilt towards Putin's Russia in the coming years? Now, Ratna, that's a really big question, and the answer to that question we could talk about India's foreign policy. But having said that, I think the answer, and let me try and answer this to you as well as I can. The most important thing as we look around today in the world is that America is a declining power. It is still a hugely powerful nation. Perhaps you could still call it the most powerful country in the world, but its strength is declining. It has been in Afghanistan for 17 long years. It desperately wants to get out of Afghanistan. It's lost over $1 trillion. Well, let me rephrase that. It's spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan. In other nations across the world as well. And meanwhile, China is rising. We've seen from the current President Xi Jinping, he is determined to make China a global power. So what does India do in a situation like that, where you have China? We know that this is a very combative neighbor on our north, and you have America, which is a declining power, and then there is Russia. Now, Russia, once upon a time, some of you may remember, Ratna, I don't know how old you are, but in 1971, maybe your parents and your friends have, and you've perhaps read about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship that India signed with the Soviet Union just a few months before the war with Pakistan. Now, if you remember, the war with Pakistan was in December of 1971. So just a few months before, there was this treaty signed between India and the former Soviet Union. And what that meant was that the Soviets promised to come to India's aid. So when the war took place with Pakistan, and the Americans sent this big warship called the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal. It was sort of sailing towards the Bay of Bengal. The Soviets at the time warned the Americans that you better pull back because we are going to come to the aid of India. So in a sense, you had the Soviets on your back. They were there to protect you in the Security Council, in the UN Security Council, for example, when there were some uncomfortable questions being asked. Now let's fast forward 40, 45 years after 1971. In fact, we are going to, I think we are in the 47th year. And the world has changed completely, Ratna. You know that the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, which means that there was Russia and there were 14 other republics. Russia became a very, very poor nation. That country just completely collapsed. It became a very weak economic power. Now, that is why when somebody like Putin says that I will make Russia strong again, the people of Russia who were used to a certain lifestyle and then who got completely impoverished by the breakup of the Soviet Union have put their faith in a man like Putin. Having said that, there is, even today, the economic strength of Russia cannot be compared with what the Americans have, nor with the Chinese. The Chinese are a rising power, I've just said, but despite their rise and despite their increasing strength, economically, they are still far away from what the Americans have today. So you have a power like Russia, which is strong, militarily strong, can produce this missile like the S-400 because it still has this very, very powerful military-industrial complex. And let me tell you, the technologies, the science, the research that goes into the military-industrial complex in Russia continues to be quite remarkable. So they're really at the cutting edge. But having said that, the economic power is still quite low. So you have a country like Russia, the inheritor state of the Soviet Union, still warm, friendly, old ties, and then you have a country like the US, which India needs, in a sense, if it wants to combat the Chinese. Now, India is living in a difficult neighborhood. You have China on the one hand, you have Pakistan on the other. What do? You have to make friends with everybody. And so Prime Minister Modi today feted the Russian president, signed several agreements. Last month, if you remember, there was the visit of the defense and the foreign ministers of the US. They had come to Delhi. And the Prime Minister is very keen that he will that he will ensure that India and the US have a good friendship. So you have US on the one hand, good friends with India, and on the other hand with Russia. So the good old days of Hindi, Rusi, bye-bye, those are over. But today it's a revamped relationship. It's a much more realistic relationship. Perhaps you can even call it transactional. But that's how it is today. Okay, I think there are some more questions coming in. Just give me a second. I'm going to read them out. So Sajid wants to know, will these defense deals affect the India-US relationship, especially agreements like COMCASA? Now, the COMCASA is an abbreviation of a communications and security agreement. And Sajid goes on to ask, will Trump waive sanctions that he would have applied on these Russian entities if they were to do dealings with India and with Iran? So Sajid, let me give you a little bit of a backgrounder on this. What happened a few months ago was that when President Trump, that's the American president, he was determined that to investigate into the Russia's alleged collusion into the presidential campaign, into the presidential contest that took place 2 years ago when he got elected president. So what he has done is, very angry President Donald Trump decided that he will sanction Russia. That was on the one hand. Then on the other, he also decided that here was this country called Iran, which was being very troublesome in the Middle East, and therefore, deal, there was a few years ago when Barack Obama was president of the US, there was a deal that the US, several European countries had brokered with Iran, which basically meant that Iran would give up its nuclear weapons design, and it would give up the whole infrastructure in return for guarantees that there would be no sanctions applied on Iran, in return for guarantees that Iranian oil, for example, would be allowed to be sold to other countries all over the world. And today what Trump did, or some time ago, what Trump said was that he doesn't believe Iran, he doesn't trust Iran. There is Israel very close to Iran, and he insisted that Iran was a threat to America's best friend, Israel. So what he's done now is that he's torn up this nuclear agreement that was so carefully and painstakingly brokered between the Western world and in Iran. In the wake of that, the US president has decided that anybody who has any dealings with Iran on the one hand and with Russia on the other hand will be sanctioned. What that means is that if India buys oil from Iran, and let me tell you, India buys a lot of oil from Iran. Iran is, I think, India's second largest supplier of crude. So if India buys oil from Iran, it will be sanctioned. And if India buys, say, missiles from Russia, then those entities or those organizations which produce those missiles will also be sanctioned. So I'm sure you would say that, oh God, what's Trump going to do, and what is Modi going to do? So I think there has been a lot of conversation these past several months. And when the US defense and foreign ministers came to Delhi a month ago, that's Jim Mattis and Mike Pompeo, the Indians made it very clear to them that we're going to do two things. One is that you cannot bully us, and we will continue to buy these missiles from the Russians because we need these missiles. We live in a tough neighborhood, and we need to be protected from these guys on our left and our right, from Pakistan and China. These missiles, this S-400 missile that I've been telling you about, it's supposed to be the best missile in the world. It has all these sort of amazing trappings. It can evidently engage 100 targets at one go. It can, it can latch on to 100 targets at one go, which means it can sort of connect with 100 targets, but it can engage, it can attack 6 targets at a time. Now, this supposedly in the world of defense is supposed to be, basically what I'm trying to say is supposed to be a really good missile. Now, if the Americans were going to sanction the organization or this complex, this military-industrial complex that produces these missiles, then India would not be able to buy it. India would also be sanctioned. So now I believe that Mr. Modi has taken this really tough line, and he has put his foot down, and he has said, no, India is going to go ahead and buy these missiles from Russia. However, what do you do now? You have to give something in a world where India's power is not as strong as it should be or wants to be. What do you do then in that case? When somebody else is coming down on you like a ton of bricks, you have to tell this guy, listen, hold on for a second. Let's negotiate, let's bargain, let's try and do something that you want to do, but you also have to listen to me. So now if the Americans are going to listen to Russia with those, if the Americans are going to listen to India with those Russian missiles, then India in turn has to listen to the Americans, right? That's what you would assume that friends and players do internationally. So in my view, although let me say this again, the Indian government has not said this formally and not said this publicly. But I do believe that India will bring down its purchase of Iranian oil. Now, the deadline for those sanctions to kick in vis-a-vis Iran is the 4th of November. So you have a month. I think India is already trying to figure out some via media. How do you still continue to buy Iran oil? Because if you're buying this kind of oil from Iran, you don't want, if you can't suddenly stop the purchase of that oil, right? Because that's going to affect your own development. You need the oil, you need the energy, you need to run the millions of cars that you have on your street, you need to run the thousands of factories that make the country go round. If you don't have not only oil from Iran, but from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, from other countries, then that will put a big brake on your own development. I believe also today during the Putin visit, the Russians have also offered to have an alliance, an energy alliance. Now, see, that's another way. So what you're trying to do, what India is trying to do, is to create alternatives. So meanwhile, with Iran, you're trying to find sort of some via media. Can the Indians continue to buy oil, but not directly? So you go through a third-party bank. Can you buy oil from other countries like Russia? So I think I think that's why today's international the international community, the world today, is in such a state of flux that there are no real friends and real enemies. You cannot afford to have either friends or enemies. You must engage with people. You must engage with everybody at the same time. So you know, if the Americans give you something, you take that. If the Russians give you something, you take that. And then you negotiate, you bargain with these people and say, hey, listen, this is what I'm willing to give. And that's how it goes. So I hope your questions are coming in. Let me take a look if there are a few more. Yes, here's one from Rishabh. So what happened to the frigates deal, asked Rishabh. When the S-400 are supplied in 2020 and India is sanctioned, will New Delhi rethink its relationship with the US? So Rishabh, first of all, I think we don't know yet whether India is going to be sanctioned or not. So first things first, India has committed to buying 5 units of the S-400. I believe that every unit has 2 launchers, and so which means that you have 10 of these missiles. By 2020, even when they start coming in, I'm not sure that India is going to be sanctioned, although that's 2 years from now, and you never really know how things play out in the international community. But as of today, I think there will be a quid pro quo between India and the US vis-a-vis the Russian missile deal that the Indians have committed. What that means is that the US will close a blind eye, will turn a blind eye towards India buying this deal from Russia, but it will expect Delhi to stop buying oil from Iran. So I think that's going to be this sort of trilateral, if you like, engagement or disengagement between 3 countries. You have US, you have Iran, or not trilateral, actually quadrilateral, because you have US, you have Iran, you have India, and you have Russia. So India and the US, while they have a reasonably good relationship with each other, there are lots of stresses and strains, of course, on trade. We know that the US has taken India to the WTO. They're fighting over little things, almonds, walnuts, steel. Trump, by the way, let me tell you, Trump believes that India isn't playing fair in buying American goods. Now you see what's happening is that the various arms of the Indian government has to deal with different relationships at the same time. So on the one hand, here is a political relationship. You have the Prime Minister, you have Trump, the PM is going out of his way to build bridges with the American establishment. You've seen the way Trump behaves with his own NATO allies, right? He's been so rude with the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau. He's said all kinds of things about the German Chancellor, Merkel. But when you are a country like India, which is 1.2 billion people, not a very rich country, we are still a middling country. Per capita income is about $1,600. What do you do in that position? How do you protect yourself when you're weak, and how do you still try and get the best deal? So that's what the Prime Minister is trying to do. So he's invited Trump, for example, to come to India. The Americans haven't said yes so far, so we don't know whether he's going to come for the Republic Day. So that's it. The Indians have invited Donald Trump to come to India for the Republic Day celebrations in 2019, but we don't know, Rishabh, whether that's going to happen or not. If it happens, that's going to be quite something, isn't it? Having Donald Trump stand at the Republic Day ceremony, watching Russian missiles go by on Rajpath, it'll make quite a picture. So there you are. On the one hand, you have Russia, and on the other, you have India's sort of growing relationship with the US. I think there's another question that's come in. Let me take a look. Okay, Nikhil, what impact will the Rafale deal have over the India and Russia defense deals? So Nikhil, that's a really good question. So Nikhil, just to tell you, the Rafale is a French fighter jet. So what happened is that for the last 10 or 12 years, and let me say here, Nikhil, that I think the Indian process of acquiring very sophisticated defense equipment is very slow and very laborious. And it keeps, so it's very thorough. But at the end of the day, it just takes years and years and years for something to happen. Now, the fighter jet deal, for example, has been on the cards for at least the last 12 or 13 years. Finally, even that did not reach any fruition. So when Prime Minister Modi becomes the Prime Minister, or Chief Minister Modi becomes Prime Minister Modi, what he does is that he is going to Paris in 2015 on a visit, and he tells the French that I will commit to buying, that means India will commit to buying 36 fighter jets in a flyaway condition. What that means is that they're ready to fly. Of course, they have to be manufactured, but once they are manufactured, they're ready to fly to India. So then it doesn't take even longer for India to manufacture those jets in its own country. Now, you know that there has been quite a bit of a controversy over the Rafale fighter jets. 36 will be coming, but the controversy is that allegedly, and this is according to the former French President François Hollande, that the Modi government told the French that they must have Anil Ambani as one of the partners in this, that was structured in this whole deal, be that as it may. So your question, how is it going to affect the India-Russia defense relationship? I think today, India is such a huge defense market. It's the largest purchaser, it's the largest buyer of arms worldwide. Can you believe that? This poor country called India is the largest buyer of arms worldwide. So I think it has this huge appetite. So on the one hand, it buys from Russia. On the other hand, it buys from the US. And now it buys from France. So while all these will have to be integrated with each other, we've had this history. We have the British Jaguar, we have the French Mirage, we have the Russian Sukhois, and now we have the American, the Globemasters, which are this enormous transport planes. I mean, you can fit several hotels into it. I think it's that big. So I think India is okay with juggling between several nations and their defense equipment. And yes, and that's how the story will unfold. But thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for your questions. Hopefully we will do this again very soon. Thank you.